The Mafia boss's mother hadn't eaten for months, until the chubby female cook arrived. What could one cook possibly do when months had passed without changing anything? And why would her arrival make such a difference? Hello, everyone, and welcome to another emotional story about family, compassion, and the unexpected people who can change our lives. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Thank you for spending your time with us and for continuing to support the channel. We truly appreciate having you here. Tell us in the comments. Do you believe food can carry memories powerful enough to reconnect people with the life they once loved? Now, settle in and listen closely, because our story begins inside a quiet kitchen where untouched plates had become painfully familiar. The first thing they told me about Mrs. Hayes was not to watch her eat. I thought it was a strange warning for a cook, but nothing about the Hayes estate felt ordinary. The house sat along Chicago's North Shore behind iron gates and enough security to make my old restaurant kitchen feel like a neighborhood diner. I was 32, 5'5", plus size, and accustomed to people deciding what a woman who looked like me should know about food. Usually, their assumptions disappeared after the first bite. Here, nobody seemed interested in tasting anything. Emily Carter, a tall man in a charcoal suit, met me outside the kitchen. Yes. Marcus Reed. I manage household operations. He glanced at my resume. You are the fourth cook in 6 months. That is encouraging. His expression almost became a smile. The previous cooks took it personally. Took what personally? Before he answered, a woman entered carrying a silver breakfast tray. Scrambled eggs, toast, tea, everything untouched. Marcus lowered his voice. Mrs. Hayes has been struggling with food for months. Her medical team is involved. You will receive written dietary guidance. Follow it exactly. Of course. Do not pressure her. Do not comment on how much she eats. Do not promise Mr. Hayes that you can fix anything. I am a cook, not a magician. Good. Remember that. The kitchen itself was beautiful. Marble counters, 2 ovens, a refrigerator larger than my first apartment bathroom. Yet the room felt strangely lifeless. No flour on the counter. No handwritten recipes. No half-finished cup of coffee beside a cutting board. It looked like a kitchen designed by someone who never expected people to gather in it. At 11:30, I prepared lunch according to the instructions I had been given. A small portion, mild seasoning, nothing outside the approved list. The tray went upstairs. 40 minutes later, it returned almost exactly as I had sent it. I said nothing. Dinner was the same. I stood beside the sink as another nearly full plate came back downstairs. 3 meals. 3 quiet failures. Do not let it bother you, the housekeeper said. Everyone tries at first. Tries what? To be the person who changes things. She carried the tray toward me. Then they learn. I looked down. Roasted chicken untouched. Mashed potatoes untouched. Green beans untouched. But something was different. I had placed 4 thin apple slices along the edge of the plate because apples were on the approved list. Now there were 3. Wait. The housekeeper stopped. Was anyone else near this tray? No. Did you remove anything? She shook her head. I stared at the empty space where 1 apple slice had been. 1 slice was not a miracle. It was barely a snack. But it was a choice. And choices mattered. The next morning, I prepared breakfast exactly as instructed. I did not add cinnamon. I did not change textures. I did not invent some secret recipe because I wanted to feel important. I simply placed 1 thin apple slice on a small white plate beside the approved breakfast and sent it upstairs. 20 minutes later, footsteps entered the kitchen. I expected the housekeeper. Instead, a man in a black suit stopped on the other side of the island. I recognized Dominic Hayes immediately. People in Chicago knew his face even when they pretended not to know his business. His gaze moved from me to the cutting board, then to the apple in my hand. You are the new cook. It was not a question. Emily Carter. I know. His eyes shifted toward the staircase. My mother has had enough people trying to save her. I set the knife down. Then it is fortunate you hired a cook. His expression hardened slightly. What exactly are you doing? Before I could answer, the breakfast tray appeared in the doorway. The meal was untouched. The small white plate was still there, but the apple slice was gone. Dominic looked at the empty plate as if that missing apple slice had personally offended his understanding of the world. She ate it, he asked. The housekeeper nodded. The apple, yes. His eyes moved to me. What did you put on it? Nothing. Nothing. It was an apple, Mr. Hayes. Apples have been doing most of the work themselves for thousands of years. Marcus made a quiet sound behind him that might have been a cough hiding a laugh. Dominic did not smile. Do not experiment with my mother. I am not. Then why change her meals? I did not change her meal. I noticed what she chose. His jaw tightened. I understood why. Men like Dominic Hayes were probably accustomed to problems that responded to pressure, money, or instructions. This was different. You are here to cook, he said. Not save her. Good, because I cannot save her. The answer seemed to surprise him. Then what are you doing? Paying attention. He held my gaze for another second, then walked away. After breakfast, I asked Marcus for everything I was permitted to know about Margaret's food preferences. Not medical details. Those belonged to her and her care team. I wanted practical information. Food she disliked. Temperatures she tolerated. Textures she preferred. Old menus. Previous grocery lists. Marcus returned with a thick folder and the warning that 3 cooks had already studied it. Then maybe I will notice something they did not. For 2 hours, I read. Chicken broth. Soft vegetables. Toast. Rice. Applesauce. Tea. Nothing unusual. Then I found older household menus from years before. Apple pie appeared repeatedly in fall. Cinnamon rolls on Christmas morning. Baked apples on Sunday evenings. Cinnamon showed up so often that I circled the word before remembering the page was not mine. I checked the current dietary instructions. Apples were approved. Cinnamon was not listed as restricted, but I was not taking chances. I asked Marcus to confirm with Margaret's caregiver before I prepared anything different. Approval came that afternoon, so I made the smallest dessert I had ever made in my life. Half an apple, baked until tender, with a light dusting of cinnamon. No heavy sugar. No dramatic presentation. Just warmth. The smell reached the hallway before I could stop it. Cinnamon does that. It refuses to stay where you put it. I was wiping the counter when Dominic returned. He stopped near the kitchen entrance. What is that? An approved baked apple. Approved by whom? Your mother's caregiver, after I asked. His expression changed slightly. Maybe he had expected me to ignore the rules just to prove I was clever. Why cinnamon? Old menus. You went through old menus? You hired me to feed someone who does not want what we keep serving. I needed to know what food meant to her before this became difficult. His gaze drifted toward the oven. My father liked cinnamon. There was something different in his voice then. Smaller. Human. Before I could respond, a woman spoke from the hallway behind him. No, Dominic. He turned so quickly that I knew the voice before I knew the woman. Margaret Hayes stood near the doorway in a pale blue robe, one hand resting lightly against the frame. She looked tired, but her eyes were clear. They were fixed on the cooling apple. Your father hated cinnamon, she said. Dominic stared at her. You used to make those for him. I made them for you. Silence settled across the kitchen. Margaret took one slow step forward, then another. Nobody moved to help her until she reached for the back of a chair herself. I remembered the first rule I had been given. Do not watch her eat. So I turned toward the sink and began rinsing a mixing bowl. Behind me, I heard the faint scrape of a spoon against ceramic. Once, then silence, then again. Dominic said nothing. Neither did I. A minute later, Margaret's voice reached me from the table. Cook. I turned. Yes, Mrs. Hayes. She held the spoon above the warm apple. Where did you learn to make this? My grandmother. Margaret looked at the dish, then back at me. Tomorrow, make 2. The next morning, I made 2 baked apples, but Margaret only touched one of them. The second sat across from her at the kitchen table, steam curling above the cinnamon while she stared at it as though someone else was supposed to be sitting there. Dominic noticed too. You asked for 2, he said carefully. Margaret lifted her eyes. I know what I asked for. His mouth closed. I kept slicing strawberries at the counter because silence sometimes needed protection more than conversation did. Margaret took another small spoonful. Dominic watched. I caught his reflection in the stainless steel refrigerator and quietly shook my head. He looked at me. I looked toward the hallway. His expression said he understood perfectly and disliked being instructed in his own house. Still, he stepped away from the table. That mattered. Margaret ate another spoonful. Then another. Not much. Nobody celebrated. Nobody counted. When she finally placed the spoon down, Dominic whispered. She ate. I dried my hands and lowered my voice. Do not make her feel watched. I was not saying anything to her. Your face was. He stared at me. Marcus, standing near the pantry, suddenly became deeply interested in a grocery invoice. People usually avoid correcting me, Dominic said. Maybe they should practice. For one dangerous second, the kitchen became completely still. Then Margaret laughed. It was soft and brief, almost rusty from disuse, but it changed the entire room. Dominic turned toward his mother. Something in his face loosened. You find this amusing? Very. Margaret pushed the second apple toward him. Sit down. Mother, I have a meeting. Then be late. Dominic Hayes, a man who could make 3 grown employees stop talking simply by entering a room, looked at his mother and obeyed. He sat. She handed him the spoon. Taste it. He did. Cinnamon. Excellent work, detective. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling. Dominic glanced at me. You started this. I baked an apple. Margaret leaned back in her chair. That is how trouble always begins. Someone says they only did one small thing. The humor faded slowly from her face, but the warmth remained. For the first time, I could imagine what this kitchen might once have sounded like. Voices, plates, arguments over recipes, someone laughing too loudly, a family instead of employees carrying trays upstairs. Margaret looked toward me. Your grandmother taught you? Most of what I know. Did she use brown sugar? Enough to make every doctor in Illinois disappointed. Margaret smiled. Mine used maple syrup. That sounds like something worth trying, if your care team approves it. Dominic studied me. You always say that. Because I am responsible for food. I am not responsible for pretending I know more than medical professionals. His expression softened. The others promised results. I cannot promise results. I looked at Margaret rather than him. I can promise lunch. Margaret gave a quiet nod. Good answer. She stood a few minutes later and returned upstairs with her caregiver. The second apple remained half-finished between Dominic and me. He looked down at it. 3 months, he said. What? For almost 3 months, every meal became a report. How much she ate. What she refused. How long she sat there. I thought information would help me solve it. Maybe she got tired of feeling like a problem everyone was measuring. His eyes lifted to mine. There was no anger this time. Only the uncomfortable recognition of a possibility he had never considered. What do you suggest? I suggest we stop turning breakfast into an examination. And if she eats nothing? Then her care team handles what needs handling. And tomorrow we offer another meal without making today a failure. He nodded slowly. That afternoon, I prepared soup and warm bread according to the approved plan. Margaret came downstairs without being called. She sat in the breakfast room instead of the kitchen. I carried in her tray and stopped. The table had 6 chairs. 5 were tucked neatly beneath it. One chair remained pulled back several inches, directly across from Margaret. No place setting. No plate. Just an empty chair waiting for someone who was not coming. Margaret followed my eyes. Her hand tightened around her napkin. That was my husband's chair, she said. Then she looked at me with a sadness no recipe could fix. Everyone keeps asking why I stopped eating, Emily. Nobody ever asked who I was waiting for. Margaret's words stayed in the room after she stopped speaking. I did not tell her everything would be fine. I did not tell her her husband would want her to eat. Grief does not become smaller because someone offers it a comforting sentence. I simply set the soup on the table and sat in the chair beside her, leaving the empty one untouched. What was his name? I asked. Her eyes moved toward me. Thomas. How long were you married? 41 years. A faint smile appeared. 41 years and 6 months, if Thomas were answering. He believed the 6 months mattered. Maybe they did. They did to him. She looked at the empty chair again. Breakfast was ours. Even when Dominic was young. Even when business became complicated. Thomas sat there every morning with terrible coffee and the newspaper folded into perfect squares. I listened. That was all. Margaret eventually lifted her spoon and tasted the soup. One spoonful became another while she told me Thomas hated mushrooms, loved blueberry pancakes, and claimed he could identify good maple syrup by smell. She ate because she was talking, not because anyone was measuring her. When I returned to the kitchen, Dominic was standing beside the counter. I knew immediately that he had heard at least part of our conversation. She talked about him, he said. Yes. She never talks about my father. Maybe nobody asked. His eyes lowered. I asked if she was all right. That is not the same question. He looked toward the breakfast room. For once, the man who always seemed to have an answer had none. The next few days developed a quiet rhythm. Margaret still had meals she barely touched. Other times, she ate several bites. Her caregiver continued following the plan established with her medical team, and I stopped thinking of an empty plate as a verdict on my cooking. I offered food. Margaret chose. One afternoon, she came into the kitchen while I was kneading dough. "You use too much flour," she said. I looked down at my hands. "That is a serious accusation. Your dough is telling me. My dough and I have a private relationship. Your dough needs counseling." I laughed. "Would you like to show me how you would do it?" She hesitated. Then she washed her hands. We stood side by side at the counter, my round hips taking up more room than the previous cooks probably had, and Margaret correcting my technique with the authority of someone reclaiming territory she thought she had lost. She did not eat anything that afternoon. It did not matter. She stayed in the kitchen for almost an hour. Dominic appeared once in the doorway. He did not interrupt. The following morning, Margaret asked him to sit with her at breakfast. I was carrying tea into the room when I heard her say, "You keep sending people upstairs with food as if hunger is the only thing wrong with me." Dominic lowered his coffee. I did not know what else to do. "You could have sat down." His face changed. "Mother, I thought you wanted space. You gave me a house full of space." She touched the table lightly. "I wanted my son." I quietly turned to leave, but Margaret stopped me. "Emily, stay." Dominic looked at me, then back at her. "I am here now." "Are you?" Margaret asked. His phone vibrated against the table. His eyes moved toward it automatically. Margaret noticed. So did I. Dominic reached for the phone, and for a second I expected the old pattern to win. Instead, he turned it face down. "Yes," he said quietly. "I am." Margaret picked up her toast. She took a bite without anyone commenting. Later that afternoon, she found me in the pantry. In her hands was a worn wooden box I had never seen before. She placed it on the counter and opened the lid. Inside were dozens of recipe cards, yellowed at the edges and covered in faded handwriting. "Thomas gave me this when we bought our first house," she said. She searched through the cards until she found one stained with cinnamon and butter. Halfway down, the handwriting changed. The final lines were missing, torn cleanly from the card. "I have not made this in years." "What is it?" "Apple bread." I smiled. "Of course it is." Margaret did not smile back. Her thumb moved across the torn edge. "I remember every ingredient, Emily. I remember the oven temperature. I remember the smell." Her voice softened. "But I cannot remember how we finished it." I studied the card. Near the bottom, just above the tear, were 3 uneven words written in darker ink. They looked nothing like Margaret's elegant handwriting. Before I could ask about them, Dominic entered the pantry. He saw the card in her hand and stopped. The color seemed to leave his face. "Where did you find that?" Margaret looked at her son. "It was always here." Dominic stepped closer, staring at those 3 crooked words. Then he whispered, "That is my handwriting." Dominic did not touch the recipe card. He only stared at the 3 crooked words as if they belonged to someone he had buried inside himself years ago. Margaret watched him with an expression I could not read. "You were 9, she said. "Maybe 10. Dominic shook his head slowly. "I do not remember writing this. You were standing on a chair because you could not reach the counter." A faint smile touched her face. "You insisted that made you my assistant chef." I looked at the card again. The words were simple. "Dominic adds apples." "That sounds authoritative," I said. Margaret laughed softly. Dominic did not, but something in his eyes changed. "What happened to the rest of the card?" I asked. Margaret ran her thumb along the torn edge. "Thomas spilled coffee on it years later. The bottom became unreadable, so he tore it away and said we knew the recipe by heart." "Apparently, we overestimated ourselves," Dominic said. Margaret looked at him. "No, I think I stopped wanting to remember." The pantry became quiet. I closed the recipe box gently. "Then we do not have to make it." Margaret immediately put her hand over mine. "I want to." "Are you sure?" "No," she took a breath. "But I still want to." That answer mattered more than certainty. We carried the box into the kitchen. I checked the old ingredients against Margaret's current dietary guidance and confirmed the plan with her caregiver before we started. Nothing complicated. Flour, apples, cinnamon, a small amount of maple syrup. Margaret remembered measurements. In fragments. I wrote them down. 2 cups of flour, she said. 1 teaspoon of cinnamon. Dominic stood near the doorway. "And what did I do?" Margaret looked at him. "You stole apple pieces." "That sounds more believable." "You also complained that waiting for bread to bake was unreasonable." "Also believable." I slid a cutting board toward him. "Then you can reclaim your old position." He looked at the board. What position? Assistant chef. Margaret smiled. You heard her. Dominic removed his suit jacket and placed it over a chair. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He ignored it. Then he rolled up his sleeves and stood beside us. I handed him an apple. Peel. He looked at me. You give orders very easily in my kitchen. Interesting. I thought it was your mother's kitchen. Margaret pointed at me. I like her. Dominic finally smiled. Barely, but it was there. We worked slowly. Margaret corrected my cinnamon. I corrected Dominic's apple slices. He argued that they were perfectly acceptable. They were not. By the time the loaf went into the oven, the kitchen smelled warm and familiar instead of expensive and empty. Margaret sat at the table while we waited. Your father used to come home late, she told Dominic. But when you were little, you waited for him in this kitchen. Dominic lowered his eyes. I remember that. After he died, you stopped sitting down. There was work to handle. There was always work. Her voice remained gentle. I did not need you to become him. Dominic looked at her. I thought you needed me to hold everything together. I needed my son. The oven hummed behind us. I suddenly felt like I was standing inside a conversation that belonged to them, so I stepped toward the sink. Margaret stopped me. Stay, Emily. Dominic did not object. When the bread was ready, I let it cool before cutting 3 small slices. Margaret lifted hers and smelled the cinnamon first. She took 1 bite, then another. Dominic watched, but this time he did not stare at her plate. He ate his own piece. It is not exactly the same, Margaret said. My stomach tightened. Then she smiled. It is better. Dominic looked toward me. You changed the recipe. We rebuilt it. Margaret reached across the table and covered her son's hand with hers. No, she said quietly. We remembered it. Later, after Margaret went upstairs, Dominic remained at the table. His phone had collected several unanswered notifications. He never looked at them. Emily, he said, how did you know? Know what? That food was not the problem. I wiped cinnamon from the counter. I did not. He frowned. Then what did you know? I looked at the empty chair across from him, then at the recipe card resting beside his hand. Only that people are not problems to solve. He was silent. And your mother does not need the man who can control everything outside this house tonight. Dominic's eyes lifted to mine. What does she need? I nodded toward the handwritten card. The boy who used to stand beside her stove. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then Dominic Hayes turned his phone completely off, placed it inside a drawer, and pushed the cutting board toward himself. All right, he said. Tell me what to do tomorrow. The next morning, Dominic was already in the kitchen when I arrived at 6:30. That alone nearly made me check the clock twice. He stood beside the island in dark slacks and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. No jacket, no phone, just a cutting board, 3 apples, and the expression of a man confronting an enemy he could not intimidate. You are early, I said. You told me to help. I told you what your mother needed. I did not expect you before sunrise. He picked up an apple. What do I do? I handed him a peeler. Try not to remove half the apple with the skin. Yesterday you criticized my slicing. Today offers new opportunities for disappointment. His eyes narrowed, but I caught the beginning of a smile. 10 minutes later, Margaret appeared in the doorway wearing a cream cardigan. She stopped when she saw her son peeling apples. Am I dreaming? Apparently, I have been demoted to kitchen labor, Dominic said. Promoted, I corrected. Assistant chef. Margaret laughed and took her usual seat. We had already agreed with her caregiver on breakfast, and nothing about that morning was supposed to become a test. I prepared oatmeal with baked apple while Dominic made coffee. Margaret talked about the first apartment she and Thomas rented after they married. The kitchen had been barely 8 feet wide. The oven door never closed properly. They owned 4 plates, 3 forks, and 1 good skillet. We were happy there, she said. Dominic placed coffee beside her. You never told me that. You never asked where we were happy. You asked what houses we owned. The sentence landed quietly. Dominic sat across from her. Then tell me. So she did. She talked for almost 40 minutes. Somewhere between a story about Thomas ruining Thanksgiving gravy and another about Dominic refusing vegetables at age 6, Margaret finished more of her breakfast than I had seen her eat since I arrived. Nobody mentioned it. That was our new rule without calling it one. After breakfast, Dominic stayed at the table. I canceled my morning meeting. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Do not become irresponsible on my account. I moved it to this afternoon. Better. She reached for her tea. I want dinner down here tonight. Dominic looked at me. I nodded. We can do that. Not a tray, Margaret said. Dinner. At the table. I understood immediately. 3 places. Margaret looked toward the chair that had belonged to Thomas. Her expression softened. 3. That evening, I prepared roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and baked apples, all within the plan approved for her. Nothing elaborate. Nothing designed to impress. Dominic entered carrying plates instead of paperwork. Margaret arrived a few minutes later and paused when she saw the table. Thomas's old chair was still there, but nobody had set a place in front of it. Dominic pulled out a different chair for his mother. She sat. I began stepping back toward the kitchen. Emily, Margaret said, where are you going? To let you have dinner. You made dinner. That is generally what cooks do. She pointed toward the 3rd place setting. Sit. I glanced at Dominic. Do not look at me, he said. She outranks both of us. I sat. At first, conversation came carefully. Then Margaret told a story about Dominic trying to bake cookies when he was 11 and confusing salt with sugar. That happened once, he protested. We fed them to your father. He ate too. Thomas loved you. Margaret smiled. Not those cookies. I laughed before I could stop myself. Dominic looked at me, and for a moment the intimidating man everyone whispered about disappeared. He looked simply like a son sitting at his mother's table. Margaret ate slowly. Some chicken, a little potato, half an apple. Nobody counted. When dinner ended, Dominic walked me back into the kitchen. He placed an envelope on the counter. What is this? A bonus. I did not touch it. For what? For what you have done here. You already pay me to cook. This is different. No, his expression changed. Emily, do not turn something human into a transaction. The words came out softer than I expected, but I meant every one of them. Your mother chose to come downstairs. She chose to talk. You chose to sit with her. Her care team is doing their work. I cooked dinner. Nobody owes me for becoming more present. Dominic looked at the envelope, then slowly picked it up. Most people take what I offer. Then most people probably make your life very convenient. A quiet breath escaped him, almost a laugh. You make nothing convenient. I make excellent apple bread. This time he smiled. Fully. That you do. From the dining room, Margaret called his name. Dominic turned toward the doorway immediately. Before leaving, he looked back at me. Tomorrow morning? I nodded toward the apples on the counter. 6:30, assistant chef. He shook his head and walked away, but he was still smiling. For the next 2 weeks, 6:30 in the morning became Dominic's hour in the kitchen. He was not there every day, but when he promised his mother he would come, he came. Sometimes he sliced fruit. Sometimes he made coffee. Once he attempted pancakes and produced something so uneven that Margaret stared at the plate and said, Your criminal reputation is safer than your culinary one. I nearly dropped the spatula laughing. Dominic looked offended for exactly 3 seconds before laughing with us. Those mornings changed the house. Not dramatically. Quietly. Margaret still had difficult meals. She still worked with her caregiver and medical team, and nobody pretended cinnamon had solved what months of struggle had created. But she came downstairs more often. She opened the recipe box. She argued with me about whether nutmeg belonged in apple bread. Most importantly, she stopped being treated like every bite carried a grade. One Tuesday morning, I found Dominic alone at the kitchen island before Margaret came down. You are cutting those too thick, I said. Good morning to you too. Good morning. Those are still too thick. He adjusted the knife. You enjoy correcting me. Only when you make it this easy. He looked at me for a moment. You are the only person in this house who never seems afraid of disappointing me. I set a bowl beside him. That is because your approval is not my paycheck. Technically, I sign the checks. Technically, you pay me to do my job. You do not pay me to agree with you. His mouth curved slightly. There is a difference. A very expensive one, if nobody around you understands it. Before he could answer, Margaret entered. She looked from him to me and smiled in a way that made me immediately suspicious. What? I asked. Nothing. That was definitely something. I am an old woman. Allow me my secrets. You are 67. Exactly. Ancient. Dominic shook his head. Breakfast went well that morning. Lunch did not. Margaret came downstairs, sat for several minutes, then pushed the soup away untouched. Dominic's shoulders tightened immediately. Mother, is something wrong with it? No. Would you rather have something else? No. Emily can make whatever you want. Margaret's face closed a little more with every question. I saw the old pattern returning before Dominic did. Dominic. He looked at me. I shook my head once. He stopped. Margaret folded her napkin. I am simply not hungry. Dominic leaned back, but worry remained written across his face. All right. No argument. No report demanded at the table. No disappointment placed in front of her beside the soup. Margaret stayed another 10 minutes talking about a book she had started. Then she went upstairs. Dominic waited until she was gone. 2 weeks of progress, and now she eats nothing. One lunch. You know what I mean. I do. That is why I am correcting you. He stood and walked toward the window. What if we are going backward? Then her care team evaluates what needs evaluating. But one difficult meal does not erase every morning she came downstairs. He was quiet. I thought we had figured it out. That is the problem. He turned. What is? You still think there is one answer? I lowered my voice. Your mother is not a locked door, Dominic. There is no combination that opens her forever. He looked toward the staircase. I hate not knowing what to do. Then learn to stay when there is nothing to fix. That evening, Margaret did not come down for dinner. Dominic did not send 3 replacement meals upstairs. He asked her caregiver what was appropriate, followed the plan, and left the rest alone. Around 8, I was cleaning the kitchen when I heard footsteps. Margaret appeared wearing slippers and carrying the wooden recipe box. Dominic followed several feet behind her. She placed the box on the island. I could not eat dinner, she said. I know, I replied, but I thought maybe I could sit here. Then sit. Dominic pulled out a chair. Margaret opened the recipe box and began sorting through the cards. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Eventually, she found the apple bread recipe and smiled. Tomorrow? She asked. I nodded. Tomorrow. Dominic sat beside her without checking a phone, asking a question, or watching for a bite that never came. And that was when I understood the real change had never been on Margaret's plate. It was sitting quietly beside her. The next morning, Margaret was waiting for me in the kitchen before I had even tied my apron. The wooden recipe box sat in front of her, and the apple bread card rested on top like a promise she had decided to keep. You are early, I said. So are you. I work here. Then I have the better excuse. I smiled and started washing the apples. Dominic appeared 10 minutes later, carrying coffee for himself and tea for his mother. He placed both cups down without asking Margaret about breakfast. I noticed. So did she. You are learning, she said. Slowly. Very slowly. He looked at me. I assume my instructor agrees. Your knife skills remain concerning. Margaret laughed. We made the bread together again. No ceremony. No expectations. Margaret measured cinnamon. Dominic sliced apples almost evenly. I handled the dough. When the loaf went into the oven, Margaret stayed at the island and told us about the summer Dominic turned 12, when Thomas drove the family to Wisconsin and got lost for nearly 2 hours because he refused to ask for directions. Dominic remembered the lake. Margaret remembered the sandwiches. I remembered nothing, of course, but somehow they made room for me inside the memory anyway. When the bread cooled, Margaret ate a small slice. Nobody reacted. That became the pattern over the following weeks. Some mornings were good. Some were difficult. Her care team continued monitoring her health and adjusting support when necessary. I never became the woman who magically made Margaret eat again. I became the cook who learned when to offer something warm and when to leave the plate alone. Dominic learned something harder. He learned to remain present when there was nothing he could control. One evening, nearly 6 weeks after I arrived, I was closing the kitchen when he walked in without his jacket. You are still here. Your powers of observation continue to improve. Marcus said you changed tomorrow's menu. Your mother requested chicken soup. She requested something? I looked at him. Do not make that face tomorrow. What face? The one you are making now. He leaned against the counter. You correct me constantly, and yet you keep coming back. His gaze stayed on mine a second longer than usual. The room felt suddenly quieter, though nothing had changed except my awareness of him. Everyone in this house changes when you walk into the kitchen, he said. I folded the dish towel in my hands. Maybe because kitchens are supposed to have people in them. That is not what I meant. I knew that. He knew I knew. But there were boundaries I had no intention of pretending did not exist. I work for your family, Dominic. His expression softened. I know. Good. I was giving you a compliment, Emily. Not asking you for anything. That mattered. Then thank you. He nodded and stepped back, leaving the space between us untouched. The following Sunday, Margaret asked for dinner in the breakfast room. When I entered with the serving dishes, I stopped. Thomas's chair was no longer pulled away from the table. It had been gently pushed back into place. Margaret saw me notice. I asked Dominic to move it. Are you sure? No, she smiled sadly. But I am ready to stop waiting for someone who already gave me 41 years and 6 months. Dominic stood beside her. His hand rested on the back of another chair, not Thomas's. Margaret touched the old recipe box beside her plate. We are keeping the chair, she said. We are just letting it become a chair again. I sat with them that evening. Margaret ate some soup and half a slice of bread. Dominic told a terrible story about his first attempt at cooking eggs. I laughed. Margaret laughed harder. Nothing about the meal was extraordinary, and that was exactly why it felt important. Afterward, Margaret opened the recipe box and removed a blank card. We need something new, she said. A recipe? I asked. A memory. She placed the card in front of us. Thomas filled enough of this box. I think the people still sitting at this table should add something too. Dominic looked at me. I looked at the empty card. For the first time since arriving at the Hayes estate, nobody was trying to recover yesterday. We were deciding what tomorrow might remember. By early spring, the blank recipe card was no longer blank. Margaret had named the dish Sunday table soup, although we had made it on a Wednesday, which she insisted was nobody's business. I wrote the ingredients in neat black ink. Dominic added one line at the bottom in handwriting considerably better than the crooked letters he had written as a boy. Always make enough for one more chair. Margaret read it twice before slipping the card into the wooden box. Nearly 3 months had passed since I first walked into the Hayes kitchen. Margaret was stronger now, but nobody used words like cured. Some days she joined us for every meal. Some days she wanted only tea, toast, or a few spoonfuls of soup. Her caregiver and medical team remained involved, and Dominic had finally stopped treating every difficult morning as proof that everything was falling apart. He had learned to ask, "Would you like company?" instead of, "Why are you not eating?" That difference sounded small. It was not. One Sunday evening, Margaret came downstairs carrying the recipe box herself. "I have decided something," she announced. Dominic looked suspicious. "That sentence usually costs me money. Only because you have too much." I covered a laugh with my hand. Margaret placed the box beside me. "One day, Emily, I want you to have this." I stared at her. "Absolutely not." Dominic raised an eyebrow. "Most people hesitate before refusing my mother. Your family has a strange relationship with the word no." Margaret smiled. "Why not?" I touched the worn wooden lid. "Because you are still using it." I said one day. "Then ask me one day." She studied me for a moment. "What should I do with it until then?" I opened the box and pointed to the new card. "Keep filling it. We are not finished yet." Her eyes softened. "No, I suppose we are not." Dinner that night was simple. Roast chicken, carrots, warm bread. Margaret ate what she wanted and left what she did not. Nobody washed her plate. Nobody turned the meal into a victory or failure. We talked about Chicago weather, Marcus's terrible coffee, and whether Dominic's pancake skills had improved enough to be legally classified as cooking. "They have," Dominic said. "There are witnesses who disagree," I replied. Margaret smiled across the table. Thomas's old chair stood quietly in its place. It was no longer waiting. It was simply part of the room. After dinner, Margaret went upstairs with her caregiver, taking the recipe box with her. I stayed behind to finish the kitchen. Dominic carried plates to the sink. "You know we have staff for that," I said. "I have been informed that participation matters." "Who told you that?" "A very demanding cook." "She sounds wise." "She is impossible." I smiled without looking at him. When the last plate was put away, the kitchen became quiet. Dominic rested one hand against the counter. "Emily." Something in his voice made me turn. "Yes." "Would you let me take you somewhere you do not have to cook?" I blinked. "Are you asking whether I want a day off?" "No, a professional dinner?" "Also no." I folded my arms. "Then I think you should say exactly what you mean." He met my eyes. "I would like to take you to dinner." I did not answer immediately. He was still the man whose family employed me. Power did not disappear because someone learned kindness. Dominic seemed to understand my silence. "Your job does not depend on your answer. Nothing in this house changes if you say no. And if I say yes, then we have dinner. One dinner. Somewhere you choose." I studied him. "Is the Mafia boss asking his cook on a date?" A quiet smile appeared. "No. Dominic is asking Emily." That was the answer I needed. One dinner. One dinner, he agreed. "And I choose the restaurant." I expected nothing less. The next morning, I found Margaret in the kitchen writing another recipe card. Beside her sat a plate with half a piece of toast remaining. Months earlier, I would have noticed what was left. Now I noticed what mattered more. She was humming. Dominic was making coffee. The old chair was just a chair. And the kitchen finally sounded lived in. I had entered that house believing an empty plate meant I had failed. By the time I understood them, I knew better. Sometimes healing was not a finished meal. Sometimes it was a woman choosing to come downstairs, a son choosing to stay, a family choosing to speak. And sometimes the first real sign of hope was simply choosing to come back to the table.